Let's move on to Jesus Christ in the Bible, and the economics of Jesus and what he had to say. Well, and whether or not there's any grain of socialism in his words.
Jesus had a lot to say about money. In fact, people who have counted the number of verses in the New Testament that deal with money in one way or another have pointed out that Jesus said more about money, spent a higher percentage of his time talking about money, at least as far as the recorded documents go, than any other issue. And so those people who say that Christians should stay out of financial matters, especially as it relates to politics, I know biblical scholars, especially in the liberation theology camp, who would say that, of course, the poor talk about Jesus. This is a theologian in Colombia, one of the liberation theologians there. At a conference I heard him say, the poor that I work amongst talk about Jesus all the time. They're so poor, what else can they do?
Yeah. It's not like all they can do is sit around and talk about Jesus. There's nothing else to do with their time.
So the attitude of Jesus towards the rich and the poor is very clearly spelled out. I think one of the stories that I think is the most striking that way is the story of Zacchaeus. And I have that here with me. It says in Luke 19, verse 1, it says, Jesus entered and was passing through Jericho. There was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, and couldn't because of the crowd, because he was short. He ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. He hurried, came down, and received him joyfully. When they saw it, they all murmured, saying, he has gone in to lodge with a man who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, half of my goods I give to the poor. If I have wrongly exacted anything of anyone, I restore 4 times as much. Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, because he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. Look how Jesus identified when salvation has come to this house. Zacchaeus was hated by his fellow Israelites because he was a tax collector.
Right.
He was thought to be a sellout to the Romans. But Jesus accepts him for who he is, but he doesn't just say, all that you're doing is great. His hardest words are always against those who are in a comfortable position and who are trying to retain their comfortable position. So he's always challenging the comfortable. But he's not doing it and saying that there can be no love for you. He's saying forgiveness is always extended as the potential for someone who changes their life. This passage is one of the clearest in the whole New Testament about how the gospel, the good news, is intended to transform people's lives, to change people's lives. So when Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, and he says that the kingdom has come to this place, he means that things that were meant to be done, the way things are meant to be done in heaven, have come down to earth now, right in this place, and that's the kingdom of God. Zacchaeus says, because he's so overjoyed, and it's really Jesus' hospitality to him, he says, this Zacchaeus is used to not being liked by anybody. He's an outsider. He's rich, but what can he do with his wealth if no one wants to even enjoy dinner at his place so that he can show off his wealth? Nobody wants to go to his place to eat. So Jesus says, I will come to your place today to eat. That breaks that stigma of being an outsider. And he knows that Zacchaeus is actually an Israelite, but no Israelite, no one Jewish wants to come anywhere near him, lest they be tainted. So Zacchaeus stands up and says to the Lord, "Behold, Lord, half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I've wrongly exacted anything of anyone, I restore 4 times as much." So he knows that it's probably correct to say that he has gouged people. And he's saying, look, anyone who's been gouged by me, I'm going to give them back 4 times as much. Because he knows he is rich. He has the money. He can do it. And in fact, he probably didn't find very many ways to spend a lot of his wealth because there was nobody to spend it on that wanted
to trade with him. Yeah.
Wanted to trade with him. At least we can surmise that. And so he can say, I restore them 4 times as much as I gouged them for. And that is the point at which Jesus says, today salvation has come to this house, because he also is a son of Abraham. And he gives the motive clause here, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. His point was not to get everybody killed. His point was not to make sure that the stars would fall from heaven and crush all the people who were bad and leaving all those who were good. His point was to see if preaching the word would enable people to turn around and to see for themselves what was wrong in their life before the meteorites come down from heaven and kill everybody that's bad.
And what's clear is the thing that was the most wrong, and that's the most pressing, clearly, is the hoarding of wealth and the desire to be richer than people around you.
And greed and so on. So that leads us into what Jesus says about wealth and the word mammon. It comes up several times. The word mammon occurs 4 times in the Bible. Matthew 6:24, no man can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon. And what I liked about the biblical scholars who pointed this out to me at first is that he says you can't serve God and mammon. It's not. He doesn't say you shouldn't serve God and mammon. He doesn't say, oh, it's not nice to serve God and mammon. It's not about niceness. It's not about what you should or shouldn't do. He said you can't actually serve God and mammon. There is no compromise position.
They're just completely incompatible.
They're completely incompatible.
So yeah, leaves no question there.
Same thing in Luke 16:13. He says the same thing there. Now, I did some research on where the word mammon occurs in other places. You don't find it in the Old Testament, but you do find it in Mishnaic Hebrew. Mishnah was written about 200 years after Christ. It was written down, but it was a collection of oral traditions, so those are oral traditions that had been floating around. In Aramaic, the word mammon means a kind of personified wealth. It means material possessions, wealth. And from there it gets translated into Greek as mammon. And from there to Latin, mammon, and then comes into English from Latin. That's where we get the word mammon from.
Because I know I've heard the phrase, one cannot serve God and money.
Yes. And it does mean money, and many of our modern translations do use the word money, but some still use the word mammon because in the original context, it's believed that there was a Syrian god named Mammon, and that it comes from that, and that there were people who were worshiping in Syria. And of course, Syriac is the later version of Aramaic, and that's the language that was spoken in Palestine and in Syria in those days. So it was, if that was the case, then you could say it was a kind of a personification of the power that wealth and material goods have over people. It's not like just putting a dollar bill on the table that lies there neutrally and waits for us to do with it either something that is good or something that is bad. A lot of understandings of money make it kind of a neutral thing, that it's neither good nor bad. It all depends on the purpose you put it to. But we kind of get the impression from what Jesus is saying that to say that money is a disembodied, to say that money is something that has no spiritual drawing power
Value
on people,
neutral, yeah.
that is value neutral, it's hard to get that, I think, from what Jesus is saying, because when he says you cannot serve, those are like the word serve is something that you use towards a being rather than a material thing.
Right.
A being like a person, like a master of slaves, or a god, or some kind of personified being, like a spirit being, perhaps.
Almost like an ideology.
Yeah. Yeah, although you can say that an ideology is a concatenation of ideas, and doesn't have necessarily a connection to the real world. But ideology, the way it's used in some definitions, of course, is by its very nature a delusion. And so, yeah, you could connect that to what Jesus is saying in a way. Because this idea, if Jesus is talking about mammon as a god that people serve, it has a reality and an existence that goes beyond just the material thing that you can see that sits on the table, but it calls to people and sort of makes it do its bidding.
So it has an inherently corrupting influence.
Yeah.
Like the One Ring in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, you could say that
which Frodo never actually overcame. He just got lucky.
He gets very, very close to being overcome by that power at the end.
Well, I think he did at the end, but he just got lucky.
Yeah, and it's the struggle between him and another one that's even deeper gone by the power of the ring with Gollum. It's the struggle between Gollum and Frodo that ends up making the ring break loose from both of them and ends up in the volcano.
Tearing it apart, yeah, the whole thing down.
And that's very much like the power of evil, very much like the power of greed, and of which is one manifestation of evil. And so mammon, you can say, is the personification of the demon god of greed, which Jesus says you can't really serve one and the other at the same time. It's not possible. So either you turn away from one so that you serve the other, or not. You know, he's saying if it were the case, two masters, either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. So it has to do with who you serve. Even, Bob Dylan wrote a song along that line, you got to serve somebody. It might be the devil or it might be the Lord. You got to serve somebody. Not everybody liked him when he wrote that song. But he kind of knew that a lot of people might not like him for saying that. So, yeah, the Zacchaeus narrative, I think, is one of the strongest. And then the other narrative that's an important one in regard to the relationship between rich and poor is the story of the rich man, Dives, and Lazarus. And the Lazarus in this story is not one that was resurrected from the dead, but it's a different Lazarus. It's a story in a parable where the rich man ate sumptuous food every day, and there was a poor beggar named Lazarus who was at the gate of his palace, who had nothing, and who begged every day, and who the dogs licked the sores from his wounds, and of course Dives, the rich man, would just pass by as far away from him as possible so that he wouldn't come near any disease that this poor man Lazarus might have. And then when the rich man goes to Hades, he begs Father Abraham to come and at least put some cool water on his tongue, because he's thirsting and suffering in the place of torment. And Father Abraham says, well, no, you can't do that, because there's a fixed gulf between you and the living. And you remember how in your lifetime you had all those good things, and you ignored Lazarus on your doorstep. So then Dives says, well, then at least send him to my brothers, so that they can avoid coming to this place of torment. And again he says, they have the law and the prophets. They have the law and the prophets to tell them.
Yeah.
If they don't believe the law and the prophets, then even if someone came from the dead, they wouldn't believe him. Because the law and the prophets should have been good enough, but
they got everything they need.
They got everything they need, and what we get from that is that having the wealth, having everything that they need, tends to cloud people's vision in regard to seeing where it all came from, and seeing what would be what would be just and what would be fair, what would be to be able to hear the cries of someone who's suffering like Dives, like Lazarus was.
If you have wealth, no matter how you got it, you think of it as just.
Yeah. You think that you worked for it, and that you had special gifts and talents that made your work worth way more than the work of someone who plows the fields.
And in fact, I think there's studies on this, on the psychology of wealth and rich people, and how they think they earned it, regardless of how. If I have a study, I'll put it up in the in the screen there.
So I think these narratives of Zacchaeus and of the dialogue between the rich man and Lazarus are two of the stories in the New Testament that give us perhaps more understanding of Jesus' attitude towards wealth than perhaps the Jubilee year does.
Given the totality of the Bible, the Jubilee, and what Jesus has to say about wealth, given all of that, how do we reconcile that, the clear message of the Bible, with modern evangelical Trump voters justifying it by saying, well, Trump is going to stop abortion. He's getting all these judges, and he's against trans rights and homosexual rights, and these are the real important issues to them that are keeping him. I mean, Trump is saving babies, is what they're justifying it with.
I think that's a very, very sad direction that things have gone. I was surprised to find out that 4/5 of self-identified evangelicals and fundamentalists had voted for Donald Trump. I wouldn't have thought that the proportion would be quite that high in previous decades. But what's been rolling out over the past 30 years, in the days that Ron Sider started Evangelicals for Social Action, of course, I think that group attained a wide following in the 1970s and 80s. But it also provoked a reaction in conservative circles as well. So you had groups starting up with names like the names of Mr. Lindsley's organization on Institute on Faith, Wealth, and Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. So those organizations, and they don't always last very long, but they have had an influence on people's understanding about biblical economics. I think what we can say, though, is that biblical illiteracy in general has increased over the last 50 years. Far fewer people are familiar with what Jesus taught.
Even the Christians who are going to church.
Even biblical, yeah, just going to church doesn't mean that they're going to hear these passages read. And especially, ironically, in evangelical churches, frequently there is only one scripture passage read. It is most often either from the Gospels or from the letters of Paul, but more and more you don't find biblical exegesis being done in sermons. You find a kind of, and especially this is true in the health and wealth, prosperity gospel preaching churches, which
health
are in
and wealth.
Health and wealth, that God wants you to have health and wealth and prosperity, and I believe that's true. God does want us to have health and wealth and prosperity, but what is attached to that often in what's called the prosperity gospel preachers is that they themselves are very, very wealthy. And they get that way by saying to people in their megachurches, you must tithe your income in order to be a member of this church. So people will become familiar with one verse in the Old Testament that tells people to bring the full tithe into the storehouse. But they will neglect other portions of the Old Testament where it says that, well, the tithe is to be brought every third year, and that a portion of it is for the poor, not for the church, but for the poor, and for those in need. So the portion of it that was to actually be for the priesthood or for what we now call the church is not even specified. And the idea that you bring it and give that full tithe to the church is actually quite wrong. There are a number of biblical scholars pointing that out, but their voices tend to get drowned out in the larger media message. Now, what's happening when you turn it around to, say, the abortion question is that there's been since the 1980s a trend on the part, and I trace it historically to Rousas Rushdoony, who wrote a book called The Institutes of Biblical Law. It's a big, thick book about the Old Testament law. He was a self-taught scholar, which means that he didn't put his theories through the matrix of critique from other scholars.
Didn't do the peer review.
And didn't do the peer review. Which doesn't necessarily mean that everything you say is false, but it means you should be wary that some of his ideas were never tested out on people who had the substance to be able to critique them. So he influenced an evangelist to the intellectual classes named Francis Schaeffer. And Francis Schaeffer's books in the late 60s, The God Who Was There, were mostly about worldview shifts that have tended to undermine belief in God over the past century or two. That's his early work, but he taught that in Switzerland. When he came back to America, he was increasingly influenced by Rousas Rushdoony, who had taught that all of the laws of the Old Testament were to be enacted today. All of them, including those in regard to ritual purity. But when I read Institutes of Biblical Law about what Rushdoony said about the biblical Jubilee, he didn't say anything about it. He just left it out.
That's curious.
And the Sabbath year laws, there's no comment on it. So the good things in terms of social justice and care for the poor that the Old Testament law had spelled out, Rushdoony completely eliminated from his commentary, which is why biblical scholars don't respect the Institutes of Biblical Law book that he wrote. But Francis Schaeffer was taken in by him, and by the 1980s, Francis Schaeffer was saying that the number one problem facing America today, and churches need to be aware of this, he said, is abortion.
Jesus.
He felt that that was the number one problem, and that all of our energy should be focused on fighting that. Now, his argument was made in a way that was to some extent credible, but what following that, when you get the popularizers of the popularizers coming along later, then they further oversimplify what was already oversimplified, and you get to the place where not only does abortion become the most important issue in the Bible, but it becomes the issue that outweighs all the other, and from there, it's only a matter until you're treating it as if it's the only issue. It weighs more than all the other issues put together.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know any good biblical scholar who could ever agree to the notion, or any biblical theologian, or any systematic theologian, who could agree to the notion that abortion outweighs all other issues put together. Because if you think of it, the reason abortion is bad is because it kills people.
Yeah.
But there are other things that kill people too. Pollution kills people.
Poverty.
Poverty kills people. There are many things that kill people. And in fact, human beings are getting more and more ingenious at developing ways to kill people faster. Yeah. Nuclear bombs kill people. Drones.
Drones?
Drones. Militarization and our ability to kill people is getting more and more skillful. These things all kill people. So why are those not also issues? So that for that reason, I find more credible a movement called the seamless garment movement, which harkens back to the robe of Christ that was of all one piece, which the Roman soldiers gambled for when Jesus was being crucified. When Jesus was being crucified, they gambled for this robe of his because they knew it was more valuable in that it couldn't be torn. It was all of one piece. So Cardinal Bernardin of the Roman Catholic Church made the argument that the seamless robe of Christ is very much like what our ethics should be like. That if we say we are pro-life, we should be pro-life on every issue, not just one issue. So we should be against poverty. We should be against war. We should be against everything that kills people. And we should be, if we're going to demonstrations and protests, we should be
consistent,
even-handed and consistent in protesting everything that kills people. I think that there's no better summary than to go to the words of Jesus where he says, store up treasure in heaven, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Wherever our treasure is, whatever we value the most, whatever we treasure the most, that will be on our heart all the time. If we're looking forward to something that's coming, or something that's doing, sometimes we even lose sleep thinking about it. And if mere material wealth is what we treasure, what we value, then that is something that moth and rust can corrupt, is something that can be destroyed easily, and we can find that our work has actually been in vain. But the things that are eternal, things that can last, are the things to work for. And Jesus, I think, is very clear on that.
Sounds like a socialist to me. All right, thanks, Ian.